Talmudim Way, adding cultural, historic, and geographic significance to your walk as a disciple of Jesus. Well, Backgrounds Lesson 2. We're going to do this one in 3 parts. Luke chapter 1 has 80 verses, so in this first section we'll look at verses 1 through 13. As we mentioned last time, we start every lesson with Acts 17:11. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Why is this verse so important? I believe we should start every lesson with writing down Acts 17:11. Because from time to time we're going to be challenging things in this study anyway that are commonly taught, particularly from our Protestant sources. The main problem is that I believe that a lot of times the people that make these assertions, they don't take into account the culture, the geography, or the historical situation. In fact, that's why I started the Talmudim Way, kind of the program here. Our goal here is to get into the first century context so that we can add significance to our walk as a disciple of Yeshua, of Jesus, our Messiah. But Acts 17:11 reminds us that no matter what I say, I don't want you to take my word for it. Acts 17:11 says to trust but verify. And actually, this is what I have done with some of these commentators. I've read them and then studied the background, and I've just come up with a different conclusion. One thing as we notice, as we watch the interactions with the disciples and Jesus, or with even other people and Jesus, is that they're often questioning things. And in our culture, sometimes we take that personally, or we get emotional. But even though the tone may seem kind of heated to us, that's just how discussion was back then. In fact, Jesus often responded to a question with another question. And so it's just, in that culture, questions are just how people learned and how people demonstrated whether they grasped the material or not was by the type of questions they asked. So questions are good. Questions are a good thing, and they're how we learn today. Also, Acts says we should do our best to teach the word, faithfully, but from time to time we're all going to make mistakes. And we remember the verse that says iron sharpens iron. So Acts 17:11 tells us to, again, trust but verify, and don't believe anything any teacher or commentator tells you, whether it's me or anyone else. Be a diligent Berean, be a diligent student, and search the scriptures. Now let's go ahead and ask God to bless our study. God, we praise you for your intricately designed word, which teaches us how to follow you as disciples. Now guard our minds and our hearts. Draw us closer to you as we study, and let us study so that we may become disciples that are doers of your word and not just hearers. Let our words be your words, and give us all Acts 17:11 discernment. In the name of Jesus, Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. So part 1 of 3, we'll look at the introduction that Luke wrote to Theophilus. We'll take a little bit a peek at Herod the Great and try to understand what the political situation was around the time that Jesus was born and around the time that he ministered. Then we'll look at Zechariah's big day at the altar of incense. So it was an exciting time for him to be picked by Lot, and then he went in to go about his duties when all of a sudden he gets interrupted by the angel Gabriel, and we'll look at that discussion in part 2. But first, let's go ahead and get oriented to Luke's gospel. All right, Luke chapter 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. This is all one sentence in the Greek, as it is here. These 4 verses are thought to have some of the most stylish, elegant, and most perfect Greek anywhere in antiquity. And it was very common for prose in that day to have, or letters in that day to have this very formal introduction. And so the Greek actually, once he gets into the next verse, it actually changes quite a bit to the Greek that might have been spoken every day on the street, where what we have here in verses 1 through 4 is more of an academic Greek quality. Here you can see a painting from that same church we looked at last time in Egypt with the Apostle John. And so Luke is depicted as writing in a book because he's writing that orderly account. And his symbol, at least at the time that this ceiling was painted, was the ox. So the four symbols come from the four living creatures in Revelation 4 and also Ezekiel 1. It's the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle. And it's curious that throughout the past couple thousand years, who those symbols get matched up with has not remained constant. So at the time this was painted, Luke was depicted as the ox, and you saw on his tombstone as like a calf or an ox. Today, it's actually Luke actually gets the man today, and the reason for that is we look at what's the theme of each of the four Gospels. So Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews, so he gets the lion. Mark presents Jesus as the servant of man. So today we would say the ox is more associated with Mark because Mark is presenting Jesus as the servant and the ox is the beast of burden. Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man. So in chapter 3, Luke's genealogy goes all the way back to Adam, who was the first man and the Son of God. So Luke gets the man, and then John gets the eagle. It's kind of interesting how those change around. And it's interesting that those are the four standards of the tribes of Israel also. So Numbers 5 talks about how the tribe was organized in the wilderness around the tabernacle. And then as it turns out, the 12 tribes were divided into 4 camps, and then each camp had a symbol, and one was the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle. So it's kind of this symbolism goes way, way back. It's for this reason that when he says, I'm writing an ordered account to you, most people, if we're going to use a chronology, we're going to lean heavily on Luke because Luke seems to be the most chronological of the four Gospels. One thing that's interesting about Hebraic writing, our writing today is we're very much interested in a narrative story. Thing A happens, then thing B happens, then thing C happens. That's not exactly how the Gospels are written. They're written to weave points that the author tried to make. For example, the Gospel of John is not at all chronological, at least the first half of it. So when we go do the chronology, you'll see that largely we follow the Gospel of Luke. We don't really know who Theophilus was. You can see it's in Greek. There's the name Theophilus there. It may have been a fairly common name. We don't really know who it is. We do know the meaning, though. Philos means friendship, a friendship kind of love, and Theos is God. So the name means lover of God, so it could be a code name. In the Roman Empire, later stages of the first century, Christianity wasn't all that welcome, so there could be, some sort of code written as Revelation is mostly written in that same type of code. Some suggest that Theophilus was a benefactor of Paul, and this Theophilus then commissioned a thorough account, possibly for the purposes of accompanying Paul for his trial at Rome. So just as today we would have depositions and affidavits and things like that, this document by Luke may be seen as a type of affidavit. It is his record. He notes eyewitness testimony. So just like a police officer might be called to the stand to describe what he saw and who he talked to, Luke may have been in that role to attest to this document's authenticity and to everything that was written in it. All right, verse 5. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. So from this lofty Greek in verses 1 through 4, this now feels like something out of the Old Testament. You have a righteous couple. Abraham and Sarah immediately come to mind with that one, where God, comes down personally, speaks to both of them, and says, "You're going to bear bear a son. Luke is going out of his way to let us know that they were both righteous before God. So note things like from the daughters of Aaron in verse 5. That's just a nugget that we might be inclined to pass over. We might just say, "Hey, Zechariah had a wife. His wife's name her name was Elizabeth." But we have this from the daughters of Aaron, and that is just a nugget that if you would, if anyone takes the time to dig into it, you're rewarded with a deeper insight. And that insight is a Levite like Zechariah, although they could marry anyone, it was considered all the more pure and all the more righteous to marry another Levite. So it's just an exclamation point that Zechariah was very righteous, and their childlessness was not a punishment of any kind of sin or being unworthy and that kind of thing. And the reason that's pertinent is because in that culture, childlessness, even way back to Abraham and Sarah, childlessness was viewed as a judgment. So Luke is going out of his way here to tell any Jewish readers that would have this background that they were not childless because of judgment. So it says, in the days of Herod, verse 5 said, in the days of King Herod. Any attempt, I think, to understand the political situation in Israel during the time of Jesus is going to be quite limited without some kind of study of Herod the Great. Dr. Schlegel, who wrote one of the resources I use, he writes that Hollywood should make a movie out of Herod's life, because his life had all the elements that Hollywood likes: war, violence, romance, sex, intrigue, assassinations, and so forth. So you can see from this map here that no one since Solomon controlled as much land in the region as King Herod did, and no one has ever since, by the way. His footprints are all over the Holy Land in terms of his many building projects. And I have to say, the people, he had a love-hate relationship with the people. The people loved him because of all of the building projects that they did. So shovel-ready jobs, literally, which provided employment, which provided income, and that kind of thing. So some of those I'll just highlight them here. So Strato's Tower, which we now call Caesarea, there was a tremendous palace, and it's actually when you go to Israel on a typical tour, one of your first stops is Caesarea, and it's just an absolutely beautiful spot. And we know it as where the gospel went forth into the Gentile lands in Acts 9 and 10 there. So it was really the birth of us being included as Gentiles. So that's Caesarea, but it's just absolutely beautiful spot, and the history there is fascinating. He has a palace in Jericho. He built a palace in Herodium, which is down by Bethlehem. Scholars think that is where he's buried. They believe they have found his tomb, and that was just a few years ago. There was a National Geographic issue all about Herodium that I think I can't remember the date. I should have looked that up first. But anyway, great episode, and it kind of went into this magnificent building structure. Masada down on the Dead Sea is probably one of the most famous buildings that he built outside of the Jewish temple, which I'll talk about next. Masada is where it's sort of like the Alamo of Jewish history. So the Alamo is where our Texans made their last stand. The Masada, Herod built it for himself to defend against an insurrection, but come to find that when Rome was sacking Jerusalem and the area, that a band of rebels overtook Masada and kind of held up there and made it their last stand. It was thought to be impregnable, but the Romans had to build this siege ramp all the way up. And I won't ruin the story because it has an incredible ending, but we'll talk about that some other time. But it's not related to the Bible. It's just the history of the time, and it's just a great story. And of course, the crown jewel is probably his temple at Jerusalem, which, although the old city walls around Jerusalem are from the 1600s, where the western wall, what makes that so sacred is that there is one of the retaining walls of the temple. So it's not the western wall of the temple, it's the western retaining wall. That area still contains a part of the old Herodian wall from way back, even before Jesus. So So his building projects are well known. So unfortunately, he was also one of the most ruthless dictators to ever live. So for that reason, he was truly hated by the people, and they feared him and wanted nothing to do with him. He clearly suffered from some form of paranoia and megalomania. He didn't hesitate to eliminate anyone that he saw a threat to his power, and that includes immediate family members. There was a quip that it was safer to be a pig in Herod's house than one of his sons, because at times he had his own sons murdered. He actually married his wife and then subsequently killed her. Her name was Mariamne, if I pronounced that right. And then he later wailed because of her death. So just this, obviously he had some mental issues going on here. As he was dying, he gave an order to have some very popular Jewish leaders and rabbis arrested, and then upon his death, he ordered them executed, all because he insisted that the people should be mourning on the day that he died. So fortunately, when he died, that order was not carried out, but he did enough of other bad stuff that he really is one of the true villains in world history. But it was in the midst of this darkness that God became directly involved in man's affairs and started moving again. So you may have heard the 400 years of silence between the book of Malachi and then God's appearing. That was all during this period. And so out of darkness, a light comes. Luke doesn't give a specific location for the home of Elizabeth and Zechariah, but traditionally, it's known as Ein Karim. I'll talk a little bit more about that in part 2 of this video, but it's right outside Jerusalem, very hilly, very, very nice country where Zechariah and Elizabeth lived. Verse 8, now while he was serving as priest before God when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. I won't go into a whole lot of detail about what it meant to be a priest, but in summary, there were probably as many as 18,000 Levites who could serve as a priest for what Zechariah was doing here. So truly, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for Zechariah, and so his job was to kind of kindle the incense and get that lit. He was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord. It says that in verse 9. So this is a modern picture of the Temple Mount. You're actually looking at the most hotly contested piece of real estate in the world, and a lot of battles going over it. So most scholars, not all, most scholars believe the Jewish temple was located right there, right where the golden Dome of the Rock, which is now a Muslim shrine, is there today. A lot of people think it's a mosque. It's actually technically not a mosque. It is a shrine. This over here is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So if you've heard that term, this is actually the third holiest spot in Islam. And just for a little bit of history there, their tradition says that Muhammad was summoned to Al-Aqsa, which means the farthest place. And in their telling, it doesn't actually say Jerusalem, but they interpret that to mean Jerusalem. And then Muhammad was led over here. This actually is, when it says Dome of the Rock, there actually is a rock under that, which they believe is the foundation of the world. And in the Muslim tradition, Muhammad elevated on a horse of some kind up to heaven from that spot. So that's why they hold that spot very sacred as well. Jews and Christians hold this as the spot where Abraham offered Isaac, and of course the spot of the Jewish temple as well.
This is a model of first century Jerusalem that's at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And so here's a model of the temple. It's hard to tell in this picture, but the temple was somewhere between 3 and 5 times taller than the Dome of the Rock is today. So this was just a massive structure. And when Herod went out, he did things big. It was said the reflection of the sun hitting the gold could be blinding. and was seen for miles. So you can see kind of the gold overlay on the top of the temple. That doesn't do it justice. This model does. So Zechariah would have entered the big door there and to offer incense in the holy place.
This replica depicts the altar as it may have looked inside the tabernacle and then eventually inside the temple. There is a model in the way south of Jerusalem called Timnah Park where there's a living tabernacle model that would be cool to visit someday. I've never been there. The altar of incense was in the center of the priestly sanctuary, but outside the Holy of Holies. And so if it was Zechariah's job to burn incense, he would have done it at the altar, the horned altar of incense. These are shovels. So if you remember the previous picture that had the replica implements, these are actual temple implements. These were removed or discovered at the high place of Jeroboam. Way up in the north, there's the city of city of Dan, which we now call Tel Dan. So these were found there. So pretty good idea of what the incense implements look like that were in use by ancient Israel. Verse 10 says the whole multitude of people were praying outside at the time of the offering. So not that there were this many people. I have no idea how many people there were, but this is a modern day picture of the Western Wall prayer area. And so it kind of gives you the idea of people standing outside the temple waiting for something fabulous to happen. The hours of the morning and evening sacrifices were also the major public hours of prayer in the temple. And you can compare that to Acts 3:1, where it talks about that even after the resurrection, the temple was still a very big deal to the disciples. So they wanted to be part of that temple worship. And then at night, they would then have their Saturday night probably is when they had their church services.
We'll end part 1 here, and then in part 2, we'll continue with Luke 1 and the first 2 oracles, the appearance of Gabriel to Zechariah in the temple, and then the Annunciation to Mary up in Nazareth. We'll see you for part 2. We hope you've enjoyed this lesson. For more information, find us on the web, www.talmudimway.org.